Hello and welcome to On Geopolitics, the podcast that looks at geopolitics in historical context, with myself, Ali Ansari, and my colleague, Suzanne. We've been away for a little while, but we're now back, all refreshed after the Christmas holidays and a bit more by the sounds of it. So what are we talking about today, Suzanne?
Well, Ali, we are looking at geopolitics in a historical context, and I thought we'd start our podcasts of this year, and recognizing that we've already some way into the year, with the question about history and its relation to geopolitics. So we've called this, Can We Escape History? And the thing that prompted my thinking about this was a discussion I had last week with the Imperial War Museum in the context of a question about how we tell the story of what's happening as a consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And one of the people who was there was a lady called Yulia Vaganova, who is acting director of the Bogdan and Varvena Khanenko National Museum in Kiev. And she just said one thing that made me think about the way that we've all responded to what Russia has done. And she said, the current conflict was not inevitable. And by saying that, what she was actually saying is all the discussions that we're having, one way or another, are about whether or not it could have been avoided, on the one hand. So could NATO have done something differently? Was it because of the way we behaved towards Putin? That sort of question. But then more broadly, the way that history is used to sort of set out a series of things that are kind of determined for the future. So because Crimea was Russian, it must be Russian. Because Ukraine was this kind of Russian sort of heartland, it must therefore be Russian again. And her point that she was making was that none of those things must be the case just because they were the case in historical terms. So that made me think a lot about discussions that you and I have had already, Ali, on this podcast and elsewhere about how history is used to justify an action, how it drives grievances which cause effects. How actually all of us have turned to history to understand and explain what is happening. And so, books like Orlando Fige's History of the Crimean War, I don't know, it's probably sold a lot more copies in the last year than it had in the preceding 5.
I bet.
Because everybody sort of wants to know. And of course, Putin, I think, has actually won on this point, because you could argue that he has very successfully educated all of us in Russia's historical right to the territory that is now Ukraine, which was something that we were much less aware about a year ago. So that was my sort of start point on all of this. The current conflict was not inevitable. Just because there was a historical claim to the Crimea doesn't mean it should be Russian now. And that's the start point, Ali, for the question about campus.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting because, I think what you're saying in some ways also is that it's the narrative the Russians have basically sold is the narrative that we've accepted. And because a lot of these states, like Ukraine and the other, former states of the Soviet Union are basically rediscovering their history in a way, aren't they? I mean, they're newly independent. They're recreating, in a sense, or educating us really, and educating themselves, but perhaps, I don't know, about their history to some extent, rediscovering it certainly, then, those narratives clash. And we begin to see, I think, as your contact said, at the Imperial War Museum, that in a sense, we've been drawn into this conflict really through the prism of a highly sort of Russian narrative about what it means. I mean, I remember years and years ago, after the fall of the Soviet Union, meeting people from Ukraine and being quite surprised at the way in which they insisted that they were Ukrainian and not Russian. I had always assumed, rather naively, obviously, that, well, you're sort of like a subset of Russia or something, I mean, that was just the way I saw it, which is obviously clearly incorrect. And, but it was so embedded, so part of that. So it becomes part of that historical legacy and that inheritance. And I suppose, one of the things that in terms of policy making and in terms of how we look at things is the way in which, as you're saying, history is used and abused. I think it's probably abused more than it's used, to be honest. I mean, given the fact that I think one of the things we've discussed is how poorly, how historically illiterate actually a lot of us are. I think in many ways we're better in the United Kingdom actually, but there's still some way to go. I mean, if you look at other countries, I think it's somewhat worse. But there's a lot of interest in history, but there's a lot of interest in what we might term popular history, isn't there? It's not really a history that is sufficiently detailed or sufficiently engaged with the arguments. And so often we end up, as we've seen in political discussions, in the United Kingdom, actually, relating obviously to recent political events and others, we're often taking a very one-dimensional, somewhat sort of waxwork imitation of history, really, to make the case. And I'm struck that obviously historians have engaged with this sort of stuff, as have philosophers, but that one of the things that I was very struck about when I was doing my own research was an article, in actual fact, written by the German philosopher Nietzsche, enough to put anyone off, you might suspect. But
yes, I'm wondering where this is going, Ali. But
I know, but Nietzsche has a wonderful line actually, and he says that the problem with countries, and he's obviously talking at high tide when the nation state, if you want, for want of a better word, is sort of emerging in the 19th century, and he sees how history is handmaiden to the development of this nation state. But he says that the problem that many of these states have is that they have an oversaturation of history. And I thought that's a fascinating term, actually, because it's not so much that we are anchored in our history and therefore able to move forward, confident on where we've come from, and therefore we can look forward. What he was saying actually is we're trapped by it. And we can't move forward. And I thought that was, I thought that's quite an interesting way to look at it, that you can actually have too much of a good thing, I hesitate to say. But that was the that was the argument that was coming across. And of course, we see that in a whole range of different experiences that we've had, all over the world, actually, not simply the non-European world.
Well, I was thinking, Ali, because this was my sort of devil's advocate point. You and I are both historians.
That's right.
You are a professional historian. I was a historian once, and still think like that. And obviously, this latest Russian action is one of a series. There is no limit to the number of examples we might be able to provide, which show essentially justification for some sort of action because of a need. It's a grievance-based narrative, isn't it? So history is used to create a sense of identity, to create a justification, to create grievances that motivate people to act and divide and build loyalties, but also build enmities. All of that comes from a narrative which uses selective aspects of history to create this sort of simplifying thing that motivates. And I just suddenly thought, wouldn't we all be so much happier if we
didn't have it?
If we just didn't have it. If we just and there's obviously there's a complicated line somewhere between forgetting and ignorance. And
That's right.
And somewhere in the middle there's the bit about forgiveness and learning, which I know we're going to talk about some more. But even within the UK, the divisions within the UK are based on all sorts of historical narratives, none of which, of course, are anything other than a selected set of facts used to build an identity or a cause. And yet, because of them, we're all deeply rooted in particular positions, which mean that we're constantly having arguments with each other. And Brexit and Scottish referendum and all the rest of it are all just examples of that. And then you put it on a global geopolitical scale. We're doing that as countries. We're doing that as groups of countries. And in a way, we're destined to fight with each other because we keep remembering our history. So the really radical solution would be that we should all forget and just be happy. But I appreciate that that's not possible. So what we're going to look at instead is, I think, Ali, more about how history is used to drive grievances and to drive action and also to drive inaction, I think, as well.
But I mean, to take that point, which I think is an interesting one, don't you think actually in some ways that, one of the differences, of course, between Britain and the EU is simply that the EU wants to forget that history. You know, the Europeans want to forget their recent history and to build a new history almost, don't they? So they want to build a new history of cooperation and collaboration, almost as if all those rivalries and wars and everything hadn't occurred. But ironically, what's happening is that, the erasure of particular identities is actually resulting in all these sort of nationalist movements emerging. You see some of the worst aspects of it, obviously, in Central Europe. And all coming out with a certain amount of grievances. Because one of the things, as you say...
Do you mean Hungary there? Or are you...
Possibly, okay. Yes, possibly, yes.
I'm just thinking, because some Central European countries, you wouldn't want to...
No, that's true, that's true. So, so Hungary, I think it is. But, there are, if you look at a range of, every country wants to sort of establish a certain identity. So part of it's an identity issue, but another part of it is also, a sense of grievance. And they build up these grievances against normally a more dominant power, whether it's, Brussels or Westminster. So they sort of argue that they've been hard done by. And you see this repeated in all sorts of nationalist ideologies around the world. I mean, it's not obviously limited to Europe at all, but it is very interesting that they sort of select these things out. So however much you try to reshape that narrative, and however much we, in a sense, want to forget that some of those narratives, I think that it's almost like a constant struggle, a constant sort of negotiation and struggle for that historical landscape. Because if we vacate it, someone will come and occupy it that's deeply unpleasant. That's the issue. So, in a sense, while your argument about, let's forget all about it and let's not have history, which is obviously a nice, because I don't believe for a moment, Suzanne, that you believe that, being a good, thorough historian.
I don't believe that, but I'm just being a
but you want to put that out there. Yes, absolutely. And I think it's worth thinking about, because I think some very idealistic people would want to pursue that. But the problem I think we found, and we find repeatedly, is that the minute you try to, how should we say, hollow it out, vacate it, sort of remove the memory or whatever, someone else, less salubrious in a sense, will come and occupy. And it's something I should say that, and I was fascinated by this really, was Butterfield, who wrote his critique of Whig history. So if you look at,
do you want for some of our readers, listeners, for some of our listeners who might not know who Butterfield is, can you explain?
Yeah, let me explain. So, one of the great narratives of English history is regarded, and somewhat contemptuously regarded, it has to be said, as Whig history. And that Whig history is this narrative basically identified as a narrative of progress that sees sort of like an inevitable sort of ascension of England and Britain through a sort of a constitutional progress. If you want to push it back to the Anglo-Saxons, you can. But, largely, if you look at Macaulay, who's the chief architect of this narrative, really from the period of the Glorious Revolution, 1688 onwards, it's sort of a march. It's a very triumphal march, and it's almost like written as if it's an inevitability. I mean, the way the narrative is constructed is we're going towards this great destination. And actually, I should add, by the way, that I think the Americans are much, much stronger adherents to this Whig narrative than the British are now, certainly. But the Americans, it's still very powerful there. And, of course, Butterfield comes in the 1930s, and he, in a very pithy, I have to say, in the good old days when you could make your name by writing a sort of 100-page book and stuff, and or less, and a really pithy argument, sort of demolishes it and basically says all this is, is a very selective use of evidence, very selective, basically an abuse of history, a selective use of evidence that is basically teleological. So by which I mean that, you have your argument, you know your destination, you get the facts to fit that destination.
So the current conflict is inevitable.
Exactly. So that's exactly the word. So he demolishes it and he says, this is nonsense, and we, everything is contingent, and let's not get too complacent, which is absolutely right. I mean, that is absolutely right, because obviously that the complacency that Whig history encourages can be quite disastrous, as we have seen. But nonetheless, in the middle of the Second World War, I mean, this is the interesting thing. He sort of reviews this and he says, that I have to admit, and this is the other interesting thing, of course, is that it's in moments of crisis, it's in moments of high trauma that you need clarity. You need that. You can't have people saying it could be this and it could be that and it might be this and it might be that. In the same way as you look at Zelensky today, he comes in with a lot of clarity, huge clarity. Whereas, some Europeans certainly go, well, possibly, but we might not. So in comes Zenit. So again, what Butterfield does is he says, looking at this and looking at the existential struggle that Britain and the British Empire now have against Nazi Germany, my worry is, he basically says, that having got rid or demolished the Whig history and that sort of glorious triumph of, English civilization, what we've done is in his own words, and if I may quote just very briefly, because I think he certainly says it more eloquently than I could. He says, it is not necessary or useful to deny that the theme of English political history is the story of our liberty. We are all of us exultant and unrepentant Whigs. Those who perhaps in the misguided austerity of youth wish to drive out that Whig interpretation, that particular thesis which controls our abridgment of English history, and that word abridgment I think is quite important, are sweeping a room which, humanly speaking, cannot long remain empty. They are opening the door for 7 devils which, precisely because they are newcomers, are bound to be worse than the first. And I thought it's a wonderful reflection, actually, because he admits himself.
Who are the 7 devils? Who are they?
Well, I mean, what he's saying about some of it is that, you get all these sort of lesser, narratives, these unpleasant, and it's basically this idea that not having a clear idea of where we've come from and being racked by doubt and not having sort of a certain amount of self-confidence, we're actually doing ourselves and our purpose a lot of damage in this great struggle that we're doing. We need to have so again, it's not, to go back to Nietzsche, it's not being trapped by your history, but it's being anchored by your history. And in what he did, he basically removed the anchor, and the ship of state is adrift. Basically, it's in danger of becoming adrift. And worse than that, not only is it in danger of becoming adrift, but it's in danger of being caught up by, I don't know if I'm using my analogies very well here.
No, I think
it's been caught by different waves, if I can put it that way.
I see. That's the drift.
Yeah.
What I think what you're saying, or what he's saying, is that whoever controls the history will control the populace. In a way, is that what he's saying? Because I'm just thinking about, again, how Putin has used the history to, just build support for the war, which is otherwise unjustifiable. And I'll give you an example, which I don't know whether we were talking just before. In October last year, 2022, when the Russians were in Kherson, and they took from the cathedral, St. Catherine's Cathedral in Kherson, they took the bones of Potemkin. Now, Potemkin was lover of Catherine the Great, and he persuaded her to annex Crimea in 1783 and founded Kherson and Odessa and sought the creation of this kind of new Russia, which was the dominion that stretched across what is now southern Ukraine and the Black Sea. So that is 250 years ago. But as the Russians were being pushed back out of Kherson, they went into the cathedral. They went, there's a good article in the New York Times where it said, how do you get to his body? So you'd have had to open the trapdoor in the floor, climb down a narrow passageway, and then they would have found a simple wooden coffin on a raised dais marked with a single cross. And under the lid of the coffin, a small black bag which held Potemkin's skull and bones, which were carefully numbered. And they took it, and they didn't hide it. They publicized the fact that they took it, and the Russian appointed head of the Kherson region, Vladimir Saldo, said that his remains had been taken from the city on the west bank of the Dnipro River to an undisclosed location east of the Dnipro in order to protect them. So in every aspect of that, there's a story about Potemkin being central part of Russia and it being in Kherson. And then, we, the Russians, have come and we've rescued his remains from the Ukrainians who are going to destroy them in some way. They're now safe somewhere else. And of course, who knows where they're going to end up. But
did they take them? Did they take them because they saw them as somehow sacred to the national narrative? Is that what you're saying, basically, that they were important to keep secure?
Yeah. I think so.
I mean, they did because it's ironic, isn't it? Given it's Potemkin of all people, who was not unknown for faking it, from what I understand. Well, I mean, he
I don't know. I mean, Simon Sebag Montefiore, who's commented quite a lot. He was following it quite closely when it happened because he said it's the 9th time that Potemkin has been moved. So again, you've got this example of a figure in history who's remained
how many times he's been moved?
Ninth time that he's been moved. I could give you the story. Should you want? There's quite a lot of information about it in the New York Times article, which you can look up. But basically, what happened once he died, there was a sort of special crypt. And then when Catherine died, her son and successor, Paul I, who ruled Russia until his assassination in 1801, he got cross because Potemkin was more revered than he was. So he ordered Potemkin be buried in an unmarked grave. So even then, actually, you've got this sort of history and present competing with each other. So the Tsar is competing with the dead hero. Anyway, so then, basically a whole load of toings and froings all the way through the 19th century. Then you had the Bolshevik Revolution, where the crypt was opened up again. The photographs of revolutionaries holding up the remains. And then, grave was reopened in the 1980s by officials seeking to confirm the identity of the remains. So this is not a new thing. It's a consistent theme, basically since the day he died. And if you think about it, it's a really eloquent example of the sort of Russian, the attachment to history. I mean, it's a sort of medieval thing, isn't it? These are the saints' bones.
It's like they're sort of sacred relics.
Yes,
but you see, I think obviously that's a sort of an ownership of artifacts, but it's and they obviously give it a certain aura of, in their view it has a certain aura. But to go back to Butterfield, I mean, I think what he's saying is you've always got to engage with those historical narratives. Otherwise, less savory people will come and occupy the ground, which is basically like Putin. We've never engaged,
Yeah.
I mean, that's the interesting thing I think about this country. We've got a huge amount of history in the public sphere. I mean, I don't know of any other countries actually where I think history is studied more widely at university, school, but also just in popular, magazines, podcasts. Some much more popular than ours, I have to say. But
just give it time. At the same time, there'll be an insurrection.
But at the same time, on a formal level, shall we say, on a even a political or a policy level, we probably don't engage enough. So when Putin's making claims like this, it hasn't really been challenged. And perhaps the greatest flaw actually in that is the whole seizure of Crimea in the first place in 2014, where nobody said anything really, did they? I mean, they sort of said, well, it sort of, it's part of the, and they fudged it. You see similar things, I think, going on with, what was noted as the Curzon line, back after the First World War, and that sort of Poland's eastern frontier with Russia. Again, those frontiers were seen to be a lot more fluid, really, than the ones to the west. And it's always one of the reasons which I was always puzzled about. But when you get the Nazi-Soviet pact and they both invade and take over Poland, actually France and Britain only declare war against Germany. They don't declare war against the Soviet Union. And I always wondered, why was that? And partly it's because they sort of had a fairly, they weren't as hard-headed about what those borders signified. They thought those borders were, historically speaking, sort of much more fluid. But, you could say which borders are hard and fast. I mean, in a sense, borders, once they're settled, over a matter of time, they do become harder. But that doesn't mean there's any sort of, I don't know, natural inevitability about a certain set of borders where they should be. Obviously, what the Russians have tried to do is to say that, as far as Putin's concerned, the natural borders are, the Baltic and, down to the Black Sea. And I don't know, as far west as they can possibly make it. But it's very interesting how the Russians define their territorial limits. I mean, it seems they're taking a very maximalist view of their own history.
So you've made me think, Ali, then about the current conflict was not inevitable. A case could be made that some conflicts are inevitable because borders are simply in the wrong place. And case in point about the UK and our, in some instances, we're too good at forgetting, which means that it slips very clearly into ignorance. And the example I might give here, or one of many, would be the Sykes-Picot sort of territory carve up. Dangerous ground. Well, simply, so the point, the reason I raise it is not to unpack the whole issue, but to make the point that when Daesh took over swathes of Iraq and Syria, they used that narrative. They talked explicitly about the Sykes-Picot line. And if you had asked most people across the UK or France, the countries who sorted
I don't think
it all
anyone
out,
would know what you're talking about.
If you'd have asked them what it was, I don't think
James
you would
Barr
have got
would
a
know, but that's
coherent answer.
rarity.
And actually, by well, James Barr would know because he wrote a book about it very presciently. But that actually is a rare example of a book that really that was published ahead of, before it was needed rather than after, in a way, because when Daesh started talking about the Sykes-Picot line, everyone could go and say, what is this? And you've got a fantastic book which explains what it is and why it matters. But the point I'm making is we kind of had forgotten all about it. We accepted the arrangement of the states in the Middle East broadly as they are. We knew that there was a huge amount of conflict, but we weren't. But if you think about it, for that to have been a primary aspect of the Daesh agenda, it shows how long that particular grievance narrative has just been part of the narrative, and we didn't know or we didn't understand. And you could argue, of course, the same with the Durham line.
But doesn't it exemplify the very thing we're talking about? That, along that with Westphalia, by the way, I mean, as James Barr shows, Sykes-Picot was never implemented. If Sykes-Picot had been implemented, the French would have been governing much larger tracts of the Middle East. The fact is that the important thing is I suppose the theme behind it, that obviously European powers had come and divvied up parts of the Ottoman Empire. That's quite true. But the interesting thing is that people, what they do is they hang on to these catchphrases. So they talk about the Balfour Declaration. They talk about Sykes-Picot. They talk about Westphalia. And it becomes a sort of a token, a historical token, which is rich in meaning, but not actually the correct meaning. I mean, not actually the correct meaning.
Yes, so it becomes a shorthand for...
Shorthand. That's the word I was looking for.
France and Britain turned up in our territory, divided up our countries, and it's been a mess ever since. That's what they're saying, and we want to do it our way.
That's right. And that's what they're saying. But of course, they're not, and we've talked earlier in a previous podcast about the whole notion of Khorasan, which is also quite interesting, because I suppose that's a reverse case where they have this understanding of Khorasan that's like VAR, it's almost basically the whole of Central Asia as far as I can see. But the obviously our understanding of it is quite different, and that reading we need to also understand the reading that they have. But their understanding, I mean, I have to say is interesting, because it is very shorthand, it is very summary. And in many ways it's just plain wrong, actually, their understanding of it, but they take certain things away. And, I think from a Western perspective, things have to be engaged with more fully. I mean, I think many people from a Western perspective spend far too much time apologizing rather than explaining, if I can put it that way. There is room to apologize, obviously. I mean, I think there are huge errors that have been done. And it's no doubt that often, to paraphrase James, these lines in the sand were sort of basically drawn without much attention to some of the very important detail. I mean, we can see that in Africa too, obviously, for obvious reasons. But they weren't wholly, it wasn't entirely correct. I mean, Iraq was created out of 3 Ottoman vilayats, for instance. I mean, I have to say, it was a particularly bad jigsaw puzzle in that sense. But nonetheless, there were administrative centers in which these sort of constituent areas, there was a reason they were put together the way they were. It obviously wasn't necessarily the best reason, but and there were always going to be problems. I mean, certainly other peoples in the regions, like the Kurds, for instance, are coming back into prominence again because of recent events, both in Iran and elsewhere. I think all this, they were denied, they had this idea that they might come up with a sort of territorial state at the end of the First World War. And of course, they were denied it because it wasn't deemed to be favorable at that stage to, broader Western interests. But again, that's the sort of interesting thing as they sort of take this up. And I think they're powerful motifs, but they're not entirely accurate either.
But it's so interesting, Ali, because it's that juxtaposition of remembering and forgetting. So if you are Kurdish, you remember, or you've been taught, and that's all a fundamental part about who you are, is that history of the last 100 and something years. And if you're British, you probably don't know anything about it because we've forgotten it. And so then you have, in geopolitical terms, when two nations are trying to work out how to relate to each other, understanding what each remembers and remembers, I suppose, about what the other did is a really important part of the conversation that they're having. Because if you're British and you approach the Kurds and you haven't understood what their narrative is, you're going to get it wrong. So I think, having said we'd all be happier if we didn't do any history, I'm now saying that it's really important to understand it.
As I would expect, Suzanne, as I would expect as someone, because I think the interesting thing, and you're quite right, of course, is that what bits do we forget? What bits do we remember? And obviously from a British perspective or a Middle Eastern perspective, there are certain things. Obviously, if you're an Israeli, if you're a Palestinian, the Balfour Declaration is of vital importance to your narrative history. If you're British, it doesn't actually feature that heavily unless, you happen to be of particular communities. But, it's not at the forefront and most people won't have a clue what it's about. Similarly, if you go to oil nationalization in Iran, the Iranians, it's an absolute central, pivotal moment of their national story. In Britain, you'd be hard pressed to find it. Now, what I find interesting, and I try to explain this to colleagues on both sides, is it may be important to you, and you may think it's unimportant to others, but actually there's a reason why it's unimportant. You mustn't, it is part of a wider tapestry in Britain. And it shouldn't be any surprise to you that most people in Britain wouldn't have a clue about it. I mean, why would they? Because what they're interested in is something much more local or something much more immediate. So I think that's something that in terms of geopolitics and in terms of relationships between states, we also don't do enough on the other side to explain, what's going on in the European or the American or the American state. I mean, to give you one example, I always used to argue with colleagues during the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1978-79. I talked to someone who was in the National Security Council in America, and I'd say, why did you do this? Why didn't you do that? Why? And he said very clearly, he said, in 365 days of the year, we had so many different things that we were dealing with in the National Security Council. Iran was one of them.
And it's far away.
You would understand. You would understand that better than most, I think, wouldn't you? I mean, it's one of many topics that you're dealing with, and it may not be the most important.
But I think Iran's such a good example because that the memory and the kind of stereotypes that have come out of the memory, none of the countries involved, and the UK has a very high profile in that because we did it at the time. We can't get past it. So we are completely trapped in that history. And I think, there's a whole set of conversations which is like how it is impossible for us to persuade the Iranians that we're not as clever as they think we are. So they think we're playing this really complicated game of chess, and we're not playing any, we're not. But is that right, Ali? I mean, massively.
No, I think it's absolutely right. And I think, part of that is, of course, it's politically cultivated. Part of it is also because it was encouraged by the British themselves. There's nothing better than to encourage your opponent to believe that you're omnipotent when you're not, because it's actually a cheap way of managing power, isn't it? I mean, if your opponent thinks you're running everything, well, great, let them think that. Of course, it rebounds on you when you'd rather they didn't think that. But that's one of the things. But I think certainly in Iran, one of the reasons these things are effectively seared into the imagination is because they occur in periods of high trauma. I mean, I don't know if you look at Ukraine and Russia now. I mean, obviously, in the trauma of war and conflict, this thing will be part of the memory for a long time to come. And this is why, Putin's invasion is such a disaster in terms of his longer term ambitions. I mean, the sense that Ukrainian identity has now been sort of consolidated and coheres much more clearly because of his idiotic actions. That he would have much rather that wasn't the case. And, there was a much more fraternal relationship between the two countries. Well, in the US and Iran, for instance, or Iran and the UK, it has to do, I think, with the trauma of the Islamic Revolution, the hostage crisis, certainly for the Americans, 1953 for the Iranians, as far as the UK and the US is concerned. Although I'd have to say, and I do say this, when you look at the historical record, a lot of these are sort of embellished and reinforced with the benefit of hindsight. Because, one of the things that I would say, and I said this at a lecture in America quite recently, actually, everyone assumes that the relations between the United States and Iran were shattered by the revolution. Actually, they weren't. I mean, what they were shattered by was the hostage crisis, and that took place in November 79. The Shah had left in January 79. Now, the other interesting thing, which even I hadn't realized when I wrote a study of US-Iran relations many, many years ago, and I have to say the first edition has a whopper in it, so don't buy the first edition.
Everyone,
and the whopper
do
is
not
this.
buy Ali's whatever
First
it is.
edition. No, buy the paperback. Buy the paperback.
Buy the paperback.
Buy the paper. But I tell you what it is, because I had sort of assumed, without any sort of like, it was one of those things. It's a salutary lesson to always check your facts, by the way. But I had sort of assumed that, the Iranian students had gone into the embassy, they'd taken the hostages, and, Carter, obviously diplomatic relations had been broken. I was then emailed by one of the hostages. I always remember this. And he said, I loved your book. Obviously, he did love my book. But then he said, but I'd like to correct an error. And I thought, what? Oh dear, what is this? Horrendous. And he said, basically, Carter didn't break diplomatic relations until the following March. So, I mean, and I just thought, really? So what does that tell you, of course, is that the Americans were trying to manage the transition. They didn't want to break relations. So even though their embassy had been taken over, even though their diplomats had been taken hostage, Carter, from November to March, there were full diplomatic relations between Iran and the US. I mean, there was an embassy operating in Washington. Now, again, that sort of plays against the sort of the grain of the argument that we have in hindsight, that this was a very sort of a break in relations. It was relations went south very quickly after that. No, this was a process, but obviously the benefit of with the distance that we have, we tend to telescope it into one incident. And again, I think that's interesting in the way in which history is manipulated for political purpose. Because even in the Islamic Republic, they'll say our relations with the US have been inevitably bad. They weren't. I mean, that was, and even 3-4 years after that, of course, the Reagan was busy working out, Iran-Contra and all this and shipping weapons. So do you see, I mean, it's that sort of thing. All these things in an Iranian context, incidentally, and in an American context, in some ways, are basically erased from the record. You don't want to discuss the fact that in 1983 or whatever it was, Reagan was busy shipping weapons to Iran, in its war against Iraq, especially in the aftermath of the hostage crisis. And the Iranians don't want to remember that either, because, again, that goes against the grain of the inevitable hostility between Iran and the Great Satan. So you forget it. You ignore it.
So the role in this case, directly of the historian, which would be you, of pointing out
the incongruity,
that the accepted narrative isn't exactly what happened, is really important. But of course, it's very difficult. I'm not saying that not everybody has read your book, because that clearly isn't true. But
that's clearly not
in the
true.
unlikely event that not everybody has read your book, they're going to believe the thing that they're told to believe, or that the prevailing belief. In this case, information is controlled, so they will believe the thing that they're taught. And of course, you can get really structural about this, because it's about school curriculums. It's about what courses are taught at universities and what courses aren't taught. It's about culture and all of those things as well, isn't it? Ali, I think that there's so much that we've still got to talk about that probably we should take a break here and finish this episode and then come back next time for the second half of the conversation, if that's okay with you.
I think that's an excellent idea because there's so much to talk about. So we'll continue later.
Brilliant. So thank you for listening, everyone. Ali and I were going to come back with part 2 of our discussion on Can We Escape History in the very near future. That will be the future, Ali, not the past.
Yes, very good. The future.
Looking forward to it.